Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Anna Taylor to talk about capacity building. Anna, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, as we get started on this really cool topic, I'm curious if you could share with our listeners your superhero origin story.
Well, I got started in the nonprofit industry because I was working for a corporation that had a volunteer leave policy, and I was serving as a mentor. One day I called the program coordinator and said, I really wish we had a newsletter for mentors. And she said, Why don't you come see me? So the next thing I knew, I was volunteer coordinator and then a program coordinator and then a regional director. And about 7 years ago, I made a shift over to the capacity building side of nonprofits.
Yeah, mentorship, we might want to touch upon that topic as well. But the focus really is about capacity planning. And that can mean a very broad area because obviously sometimes we call capacity could be applied, I believe, to people and to resources and to like things, systems, and so forth. So, how would you maybe, to give us as a start, a definition of what capacity planning means?
Well, so capacity planning starts with just taking a survey of what resources you have access to begin with, right? So, what is the program or service that you're trying to deliver? What do you need to deliver that? And then how do those needs shift as you expand or pivot the programming? So I look at Manpower, I look at fundraising, and I look at your access to expertise and other resources.
So, manpower, fundraising, access to expertise. What about systems?
Absolutely. That's part of I guess fundraising is all the things, all the costs that you need to cover. And so for systems, it's so dependent on what your program is. We all have kind of IT tech needs and then, kind of all of the back office things that are involved in running a business, which every nonprofit is. And then you're going to have all the things that are part of your actual service delivery.
Would you put like processes into fundraising as well, or would you throw that into manpower, or is it a separate category altogether that really doesn't come into play for capacity building? Processes in like, all right, in order to be able to do this, here are the steps, high level. And then maybe each step has a granular details of how to achieve it, but it's more the working elements as opposed to the system, which is, your CRM or your mailer or something like that.
I think that the way you think about process is a lot related to the way you kind of learn to think. So whether it's in the technology space, you're very, focused on that infrastructure. My background's in anthropology, so it's all about like relationships and how people work together to achieve things. But yeah, you're always kind of thinking about like almost a water flow, right? Like how do we get the resources to people who need them? Where do we start to have leaks in that process, right? And then how do we keep the flow going?
Cool. So let's talk about then manpower. Obviously, every nonprofit needs to have people. These people have certain skills. They might have certain deficiencies. How would you, as an ED or someone consulting an ED, say, look, here's basically the core team that you need. You need, your program coordinator, you need your volunteer coordinator, you need your grant manager. Like, are there certain typical roles that you typically see in a nonprofit? I imagine, of course, based on the nonprofit's mission, these roles might be different or shift a bit in focus. But are there some key roles that you normally plan for in terms of manpower? And then, if so, what would be those key characteristics that you would look for to say, this person would be an excellent, in your case, volunteer coordinator, as you started, because they've got this skill, and this skill. And it's okay that they don't have that skill because that doesn't really come into play when you're this volunteer coordinator.
Right. So I should start by saying that I work with startups. My organization
Mhm.
we run a virtual incubator for folks who have founded a nonprofit. And so oftentimes people are making their first hire. We even have nonprofits that are run by groups of volunteers, and they're deciding kind of what is that first person going to be. So it's always a matter of kind of looking at the skill set that the existing team has, and then where there are gaps and how those gaps align into positions. So I have a hard time saying that, it has to go like this and then like this and then like this, partially because the founder of my organization and a board member is huge into kind of effectual entrepreneurship, which is, like using what you have, tapping into resources other than cash to make things happen. And so it is a lot more kind of organic in the beginning. But where I think people run into a lot of pain points in building up a nonprofit is around the business capacity of that nonprofit. There are a lot of executive directors out there who are serving as their own IT director, their own HR director, their own finance director. They're doing the marketing for their organization. They're recruiting and developing the board, doing all the fundraising and grant writing, right? So
Mm.
in the beginning, it is very much a case of how do we start to peel off some of these responsibilities, lean into where the executive director really needs to be investing their time and where there will be the biggest kind of payoff in removing something from their plate and putting them more into the capacity building for the organization that they need to be focused on.
Yeah, thank you for calling out. Yeah, we are taking the perspective of an early nonprofit, maybe even a startup nonprofit, as opposed to one that's much more mature. Probably, well, we can maybe get to that kind of use case a bit later on because that has obviously different needs and situations for capacity building. But in that early non-startup, you kind of flipped what I said. I was thinking we need this kind of person and let's go find them versus here's who we have. Let's see where they fit. I'm getting the sense that you see more of the latter because maybe they're harder to find people and get excited at an early nonprofit, or is it just works out that way? Like, which comes first, I guess, the chicken or the egg, the person or the need?
Well, I would say that the need is what comes first because in a very large organization, job descriptions can be very precise and very static. And in a small shop, you're going to have some interesting combinations of areas of expertise. And the thing is, whenever anyone leaves, there's a new readjustment of the team. Just because you find someone who has expertise in a couple of different areas doesn't mean that the next person is going to fit in that same way, right? Like this may not make the final recording, but there's a band I love, the Pixies, and Kim Gordon left the Pixies, and the person who replaced her, I feel like they needed a bass player and they needed a singer because Kim Gordon filled a unique role in that band. In the same way, in a nonprofit, when you're starting, people are drawn to the mission and saying, how can I help? And you're making it grow that way. And then you don't hit that kind of formalized job description HR process until down the road.
And so if you have the right, if you have the enthusiastic person who wants to contribute and help, are there, or do you normally get into ways to see how you can leverage their skills in the most effective way? Or is it, let's try you out in this position first. If that doesn't work, let's try you in the second position. Like, is it more trial and error, or is it more, because I'm very structural and engineering, mindset kind of thing. So I'm trying to see if that typically applies in these kinds of scenarios, or is it really just, it's great that you're with us, try to help in any way you can without that kind of structure.
So when I think about increasing the manpower of an organization, you have the kind of administrative functions that need to happen, and a lot of folks outsource and contract those until they get to the point where they're ready to make a hire in those areas. And then you have the manpower involved with running your program. So whether it is lots of volunteers who are being managed by one coordinator, whether it is program staff who are delivering services directly, as you start to fine tune what the program does and how it operates, you start to have a better sense of it takes this many hours, this many people, this area of expertise to accomplish this much of the work. And when you think about growing the organization, this is where that kind of forecasting and capacity planning comes in, is how do we expand? Is it, by community? Is it by school? Is it, by state? Or is it by like the project or the program? Do we, like do this one thing and then open up this new thing? And so where organizations are able to grow quickly is usually where they're able to recognize economies of scale in the programming. If one person can teach a class to 10 people or 100 people for the same amount of hours and energy, then you can expand a lot before that person hits their capacity. But if the class is in person and there's a lot of follow-up and engagement, and you can teach it to 10 people, but then you have to take the same amount of time to teach it to 10 more people, then that growth is more, 10 by 10 by 10. And on the fundraising administrative side, someone is always thinking, okay, if we want to serve 100 people, then we have to, do one of those two things, like either raise money for more staffing, or, only have to raise money for the costs of that other person expanding into their ideal caseload. So, as an executive director, when you're forecasting, kind of step one is, do we have it all covered for now? And can we continue to maintain what we're doing? And then how do we fundraise for growth?
Yeah, it's very hard to change the world when you're talking only to one person at a time. So amplifying your skills and using certain times systems and processes to help automate things that can be automated, or outsourcing things, can really increase your capacity for impact, right? The more you
For
have,
sure.
if you're able to send, I like this example of, if you're able to send an email to 1,000 people versus having to mail physical envelopes to 1,000 people, you're going to be a lot faster with the former, but there's obviously trade-offs in that as well. So it's about finding what works best for your organization, what has the biggest impact, but can be scaled to a certain level while still keeping a personal feeling. There's a lot of moving parts and things to keep track of, but the idea of being able to empower one person to be able to do a lot of different things, or at least one thing to a lot of different people, I think is a big important element of this system.
Yes. And, I will say that a lot of the nonprofits that I work with exist in a space of making personal connections using technology, or making personal connections that help people make the most of technology. So, it's if you send 1,000 people, but only 100 of them read the email, then, having a personal relationship with people and having, a 75% open rate on your emails is, like, people always say that's unheard of in marketing, but in nonprofit, it's not, because that person is waiting for that email.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a relationship that's being built there, and that's, why the manpower is always kind of primary in our sector. People relate to people, technology connects them.
That's a beautiful quote. I like that. Wow, that's totally true. I'm floored here for a second. You took my breath away. Let's jump to access to expertise, because this is something you kind of hinted at before with mentorship. What do you mean exactly by access to expertise? Does that mean using the people you have and being able to get them to level up to become experts? Does it mean accessing your board of directors who should be experts in their own fields? Does it mean looking elsewhere for expertise? How do you leverage expertise?
Well, the short answer for all of that is yes. It means all of those things.
Okay.
First of all, the people on your team know things about the work that you don't have access to and perspective into, and neither does your board, and neither do, you know, so-called experts in the field, right? Because that's lived experience and it's direct contact with people. So building structures that tap into that expertise is a really important part of the feedback loop of evaluating program success. And then when you think about moving your organization into new areas and kind of new areas of work or areas of community, there's always something new that you have to figure out. There's always a new challenge, right? And so part of that is building a board and a staff team that's ready to address those challenges, right? So I always talk about like the different expertise that you're going to need on your board has to do with those kind of administrative functions, but then also the focus area of the program. So you want someone who is, an HR expert, but also with a passion for, if you're doing a college access program or something with an access, but with a passion for like career pathways and access into different fields, right? So it's combining the expertise that they're going to lend to the administration of your organization with the expertise in or interest in passion for lived experience with the work that your program does. And then what we do at Greater Sum oftentimes is our volunteers have such varied expertise and experience. And as nonprofits step into a new field of work or, a new decision making, they'll want to talk to someone who that's their bread and butter. So, now that you and I know each other, if I hear from one of my nonprofits that they're thinking about, a custom Salesforce solution, I'm going to be like, listen, before you jump into this, let me let you talk to someone who this is his area of expertise. And I'm not sending you a new client. I'm sending you a conversation that is like, this person needs to know how to make a good decision in this area. So sometimes we have that expertise on our team and sometimes we have to go looking for it.
Thank you for that. We welcome the conversation, and I agree. I think it should be a conversation because Salesforce is an investment, and it's not just drop some money and make it work for us. There's a lot more to it than that.
Oh, for sure. And what happens to people in nonprofits is someone will say to them, "Oh, you gotta do this. You
Mm.
gotta get Salesforce." And I mean, sometimes someone will say to them, "You gotta get Salesforce," and I hear it's free for nonprofits.
And free like a puppy.
And then that's going to send them down such a miserable road, right? Because that's only the very beginning of a very long story. And that happens with everything. People will say, "Oh, you got to have a golf tournament." What? No, I literally had someone say that to me early in my career, and I was like, I have never golfed. And I don't think any of my board members are golfers. And, what she said back to me was, "This is very successful in my experience." And, you know, there's always going to be a different answer based on the capacity that you currently have and where increasing your capacity makes sense. If I had put my energy into learning all about golf and recruiting folks for a golf tournament, I would have lost all of that forward progress in other areas. So you always have to kind of say, what is the answer that moves us the farthest forward?
It's tempting to use the word should in many contexts, like you should do this, you should do that.
Yeah,
And I've noticed, and I've tried to be more humble with that approach because that makes a lot of assumptions. You have to really know someone or really know an organization, I feel, before you can say the words you should. And just because it works for you in another context doesn't mean it would work for the organization you're talking to. So having that greater knowledge before you make those recommendations, I think, is an important step.
absolutely. Yeah, and that's part of mentorship is
Yes.
learning that you don't know everything. It can be flattering when someone comes to you for advice, but that doesn't mean that you have all the answers to their problems.
Yeah, mentorship is something that's really interesting to me because I started my own mentorship program for Salesforce consultants. And you're right, it's not a matter of I know everything there is to know about Salesforce, but I have a couple of years experience, well, maybe more than a couple, and I think I can offer and contribute and help someone who is a bit younger, junior than I am. But for sure, there's going to be limits to my knowledge and to any mentor, you know. But the idea is that they do have, typically a mentor does have experience and knowledge that they can pass on to shorten the time it would take for that person or that organization to ramp up really quickly, right? That's the whole goal of a coach or a mentor, is to skip some
Absolutely.
pitfalls, follow best practices out of the gate, learn. I love the expression, I have to learn from other people's mistakes because I don't have time to make them all on my own. Uh,
Yes. Yeah, and that's an important part of mentoring is just kind of being transparent about your learning process. When I mentored a high school student, I used to make a point of I'm going to put our next meeting in my calendar. And once I said to her, because if I don't, I might forget it. And I got I got a message from her months later that said, Miss Anna, I just wanted to remind you that we said we'd meet on Thursday next week. I know you didn't have your planner with you when we talked. And I was like, oh my gosh. Like the message was internalized and processed, and she's helping me out. Right? Because sometimes it isn't about, oh, this is all the things that I know. It's these are all the things that I've learned the hard way. And that's one of the things that a lot of my volunteers have in common is that they're like, I have all of this, like know-how and expertise. And heck yeah, I'd like to share it with someone who's starting this process. And if I can do it in service of this exciting, important mission of their organization, that's amazing.
indeed. I'm curious in terms of expertise, where does training come into play? That is to say, if you have people who are at your organization and they lack a bit of training in a new area, do you normally recommend or do you see nonprofits helping them get training or finding resources to help them level up? Like, where does training fit into this, to the
Yeah.
access to expertise topic?
I'm a big believer in investing in your team. Expertise is lack of expertise or experience with something just means we haven't encountered it yet and we haven't kind of unlocked it yet. So definitely there is some great training out there and there is some not great training out there. And so I think one of the things that as a sector we do pretty well in nonprofit is share and signal boost what's really helpful and get it out there so that people can make the most of what they're doing on the job.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, invest in your team is a great way to keep them motivated and also keep the expertise in house. As a consultant, for example, I see sometimes I come in, help an organization, but then at some point I will leave. And I do my best to make sure that they can stand up on their own feet, that they're able to do at least basic things, in this case within
Yes.
Salesforce, without having to. It's like having a house, right? When you own a house, you have to be, to a certain extent, a general contractor. You need to know how to change certain things, light bulbs and tubes and stuff like that. You can't call your contractor every single time you need to hang a picture on the wall, right? So you need to have a certain amount of training and knowledge in house to be able to do these kinds of things so they're not reliant and dependent on someone external,
Right. But you know when to call the expert.
right?
Yeah, for sure. And that idea of investing in your team, I think when we talk about capacity building and nonprofits, that is a huge, huge part of it, right? Like our sector has been known for, kind of low wages. And I think when we are trying to deliver programming and impact, there is always a temptation to cut costs. Every dollar we're spending has to be fundraised, right? And in a business, as you do more and more and people respond to your product more and more, you have more revenue coming in. But in a nonprofit, the time that you spend doing the program is time that isn't being spent fundraising. So there is always a tension there, right? Between keeping people doing the work and raising enough money to do the work. And I know in my own career, there have been times when I was in charge of fundraising for a program, and I've just been like, how on earth could I ask for a raise when I just have to go out and, and raise it myself? And if it goes towards my salary, then it's not going towards direct program services. And so, as leaders in the sector, I think we have to be really honest about the true cost of doing the work. We talked about like forecasting and knowing what it's going to take to grow the program, to maintain the program. And if we're not calculating living wages for nonprofit employees, then we are going to pay more in burnout and turnover of employees. It's not fair to ask people to not make a living in order to contribute to the mission of the organization.
I agree. And I also see training as a way of, because sometimes I agree unfortunately, there's wages are lower than they should be for the work that they do. Would you see as training as a kind of compensation in the sense of, as a worker, you not only you're contributing to the organization, but you should be able to get something in return, right? Training could be that. It is a type of compensation so that when I leave the organization, I am better for it as a result. I have more skills now available to me, in addition to, of course, being paid for the work that I did. Do you see that as a kind of compensation, or is it more like the cost of doing business and leveling up your employees while they're there, but it's not really an investment in them longer term, and it's not something you want them to leave with? You want to keep them in-house for as long as possible. Like there's a balance there, right?
Right. I mean, people people stay because they're happy and they feel valued. So having leadership invest in you by putting you through training and education in your field is definitely going to make you feel valued. But if you are not covering your basic costs of living, then that it is impossible to go in and feel valued by that. You're going to be thinking, how soon can I get a job that is not this job, right?
Right.
So it's another one of those chicken egg scenarios. I think that we have to invest in people, but we have to first of all make sure that a logical person can continue to do this job.
Taking a step back, then looking at capacity planning, I'm curious to see or to hear your perspective on some of the common challenges that organizations have.
The biggest one is always going to be fundraising. The first time I had a volunteer, go meet with one of my nonprofits and come back and say, I helped them with, designing the RFP for their project that they're doing, but they also need help with fundraising. And I was like, oh, yeah, they're all going to need help with fundraising. Like, that is the biggest part of expanding the capacity of a nonprofit. And like I said, it has to do with if we're doing an amazing job at the work, at delivering on the mission, we also need to have funds coming in, to sustain and expand the work. So working with startups, one of the biggest questions that people have is like, when do we get to the point where we can invest some dollars, some manpower into fundraising? And that is one of those very first, of leaps of faith on staffing or on consulting or something that is going to bring in more revenue for the organization.
What would be then if so fundraising is the first challenge, because I totally agree on that one. Any any secondary one that you think that's worth mentioning?
Figuring out those kind of what is the path, what is the rate questions, right? Like a lot of times when we do quote unquote strategic planning, what we come out with is like, here is how we will change the world. Here is how we will reach, kind of our total market, right? Like we're going to transform this problem. And then the job of the executive director is to say, okay, so backing it up and aligning it with what we know about, like big can a caseload be before we have to hire another caseworker and so on and so forth. Like, how do you grow a little bit? How do you grow a little bit more, right? It's the how do we take steps towards that goal and what are the kind of puzzle pieces that have to fall into place in order for us to make more leaps and bounds.
I'm curious to know the frequency of capacity planning because I imagine as we're talking, I'm visualizing this as an activity you do once in a while, to say, okay, here we are today. Here's where we want to get to. Here's what we need to do to get there. Here are the people we need to have, the systems in place, the expertise we need to have access to. And then once you kind of get to that place, I imagine you have to do it again, right? It's like kind of navigating through a forest by going from tree to tree. I remember when I was in Boy Scouts, they tell you in order to get out of like there's a tendency if we were just walking straight, we actually don't walk straight. We kind of walk in an arc. And if the forest is big enough, we actually do a circle. And it's not
Oh,
uncommon to get
wow.
lost that way because we're kind of constantly making a right turns or left turns. I forget which one it was. But the idea is that it's not uncommon to come back to where you started from because you have just made this huge, big arc, circle. So the idea in scouting was always when you're navigating in a certain direction, you pick a tree in front of you, you go to that tree, and then you pick the next tree, or in the distance, and that will keep you in a much straighter line. So the way I'm visualizing this conversation as well for capacity planning is the same kind of exercise of once you get to that tree, okay, there's the next tree, let's get to it and let's figure out how to get there. Is that kind of where you normally see things, or is it something that happens on a more fluid level or maybe on a more granular level so you don't really notice the trees? It's more like the grass between the trees in that analogy.
Yes, and right. So I think that tree to tree metaphor is a great one. And I'm I'm kind of kicking myself that I never really put that together as to that's why we, like we say, we're walking in circles, we're going in circles on
Mhm.
this, right? It's our brains are doing it naturally. But yeah, I think the trick is to get familiar with the grass between the trees, right? And, so that you're aware of it and you notice changes in the landscape on that path, right? Like we want to notice when the grass turns into poison ivy, but be able to course correct to where we were headed. And then the other thing is we want to recognize where there are shortcuts, right? So sometimes there's an efficiency in a system that is going to be a game changer. And, during the pandemic, a lot of the nonprofits that I work with varying degrees of success, took their programming online. And for some, it was, just kind of a separation for their community members. And they felt that distance and they didn't thrive there. But for others, the feedback was, this is easier. That, I can participate more fully because I can participate from home, right? And so, like, people's volunteer capacity grew, people's ability to make it to like classes and programs grew because there was all of a sudden no commute involved, right? And so, for some programs, I mean, they went from like working in one community to being national because they had that ability with, like how many people fit in the Zoom? That many people can come to class, right? So if we're going from tree to tree and we're frustrated because we can't get to where we're going and we miss out on those paths that are kind of like what's the kids game? Chutes and ladders, right? Like you go along the path and you know where that path is, and that's your, how you've translated your strategic plan down into a guide for operations. But you have to recognize when you're confronted with a ladder. And this might be the thing that takes you to much further along your path than you expected to be right now.
And speaking of ladders, would you consider AI to be one? I'm just curious to know your perspective on how AI might or can influence all of this capacity planning, because it tends to be a topic that touches a lot of different areas, and this is a topic that definitely is fascinating to me.
Oh, right on. Now, I will tell you, I am by no means an expert. I am a dabbler in using AI for anything, but especially for work. And one of the things that I think it does is give a lot of people access to information that was pretty closely guarded. Now, obviously, there's huge problems with that, right? Because a lot of this is intellectual property, and don't even get me started on like the artistic side of, what AI is providing a shortcut that is not at all a shortcut in many realms. But where I see people using AI in a really exciting way is like, do this for me really fast. I could do it. It would take me an hour. I'd really like to have that hour to do something else. Right. And so you can ask AI to like give me a list of 10 problems that this program might encounter. Give me a list of 10 possible communities that might be interested in donating to this program, right? So just like you would brainstorm for a long time, AI is going to give you a list and you're going to go, oh, I know that one and I know that one and that one's dumb. Like, I'm not going to do that. And then, like, oh, this one I never thought of, right? So it's it's like having a huge brainstorming capacity at your fingertips. And then as different technology subsectors start to use AI, they are making it super smart in these kind of contained bubbles of expertise. So AI is being used by fundraisers in fascinating ways, and it's a lot of it is around, we talked about that expertise and that training, right? It's a way of giving people access to all of that information in, just kind of a friendly way.
I hope it doesn't take too many jobs away from people, because it should be, at least today it is in 2024, still just a tool, an assistant, a starting point, be able to create draft versions or give you new ideas. But at least as of today, we still need the person to actually bring it to life and to round it out, as opposed to just copying, pasting whatever the AI comes
Oh,
up
for
with. So,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of college professors who are worried about that cut and paste access because you have to have the expertise to look at what it gives you and say, oh, this part is a hallucination.
Right.
And this part is, like standard practice. And then there's just some interesting things here that I might want to play with, right? But we have new jobs being generated because of AI. Like all of a sudden, prompt engineering is an area of expertise that we're going to start seeing in job descriptions, right? Like you need to be able to use this in order to do this job. This is a silly example, but AI will write puns that, like in marketing, you can say, like, give me a list of 10 words that start with are and have to do with energy, like energy. And so you get this list of words and all of a sudden you're further along with coming up with the workshop title or the slogan or something like
Mm.
that. Like AI slogans are going to feel a little bit weird, but as just like a super fast thesaurus, like it's a tool for someone who's going to recognize, this is junk, but this is a nugget of potential.
I agree. So I think that would be a great place to leave it. How can people get in touch with you, Anna, in case they have additional questions, have follow-up questions, or just, would like to get in touch with you?
Oh, for sure. Well, our website is probably the easiest place. It's thegreatersum.org. And I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn in connection with the Greater Sum. And I love talking shop.
Anna, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for all the work that you do.
Thanks, Alex.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.